Welcome to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game. In this game, two players duel each other using a variety of monsters, spells, and traps. To defeat their opponent, they must be the first to drop their opponent's life points from 8,000 to 0 by attacking with their monsters. This is the most common way to win a duel. But there are also several other ways to win. You can obtain an alternative win condition, such as getting the 5 pieces of Yugioh the Forbidden One into your hand, and some duelists try to win by utilizing enough cards that they could inflict 8,000 points of effect damage to their opponent. We call this burn. And the last way to win is to arrange a scenario in which your opponent is unable to draw cards from their deck when they are required to do so. This will cause them to lose the duel, thus winning you the duel, and we call this deck out. So what is a trading card game? A trading card game is simply a game where all players have to obtain their own deck by purchasing cards, either from sealed products bought from retailers or as singles from other players, for money. Sealed products are booster packs, starter or structure decks, or other special game boxes created by the creator of the game, Konami, that they sell in order to make a profit as a business. Whereas singles are cards that have already been obtained by other Yu-Gi-Oh players who either don't need them or have them so that they can trade them for other cards that they do need. Alternatively, they can just sell their cards to make their money back. There are over 10,000 cards in the game, so you can technically make your own unique deck. Although many players choose their first deck by doing research on the internet from places such as YouTube or other websites, or from their friends to help them get started. Yu-Gi-Oh can be a very expensive game, and it's important to try and do research in order to make sure you don't overspend on your first set of cards. As you will be changing your deck over time, as you obtain newer and better cards, you don't want to overinvest in the cards that you're not going to be using long term. So it is either recommended that you immediately start out and spend the money to buy the deck that you want, or to buy a cheap deck so that you can learn how to play the game, and then buy a good deck when the cards you wanted to play get reprinted, making them cheaper. This will happen from time to time. In order to duel, you will need to obtain a deck. The main deck includes 40 to 60 cards. That's the minimum and the maximum. You can play up to 3 copies of any card with the same name in your main deck, extra deck, and side deck combined. There are also some cards that are officially forbidden from tournament play, as in you can play 0 copies. Limited cards, meaning you can only play 1 copy, or semi-limited cards, meaning you can play 2 copies of the card between your main, side, and extra deck. There are some cards that are always considered to have the same name, such as Polymerization and Fusion Substitute. You can play 3 copies of Polymerization, but if you do that, you can only play 0 copies of Fusion Substitute. But if you play 2 copies of Polymerization, you can play 1 copy of Fusion Substitute. There aren't too many cards in the game where their name is always treated as the name as another card. But if it happens, it's something you should be aware of, as it affects deck building. Deck building is one of the most important aspects of the game. It's generally a good idea to play a deck as close to 40 cards as possible, because there is an optimal number in which a deck should be at in order to function with its maximum efficiency. And generally, that number will be something under 40 cards. And since 40 is the smallest number of cards you can play in a deck, it's generally the number of cards you would like to try and play, as it means you'll get the cards you'll want to draw faster. Depending on what your strategy is, the optimal number may be something higher than 40, in which case you should play that many cards. You'll also need an extra deck, which consists of 0 to 15 cards. The cards that are put into the extra deck are Xyz monsters, Synchro monsters, Fusion monsters, and Link monsters, or one of those types that is also part Pendulum monster. You can play any of these types of cards or none of them at all. This decision will be based on the deck you intend to build. These cards do not count towards your 40 card minimum deck list, nor your 60 card maximum deck list. They do count against your 3 card maximum copy of a card with the same name. These monsters are generally going to be a toolbox of options of effects that you can access at any point during a duel if you build your deck to allow you to access these different options. It is very rare that you will ever have a logical reason to play a number of cards in your extra deck other than 0 cards or 15 cards. The more options you will have access to during a duel, unless you wish to play a particular deck that will require you to play less than 15 cards in your extra deck. Usually 0. There are a few cards in the game that have effects that work specifically because you have less cards in your extra deck than your opponent. But that is very rare, and generally these cards don't see any play. There are actually some decks that require you to have no cards in your extra deck at all, and these decks are more likely to be played than those cards that require you to have less cards in your extra deck. But usually having cards in your extra deck will be better than playing a deck that chooses not to use them. You may also play a 0 to 15 card side deck, which is a separate deck of cards that you can use to switch into your deck in between games of a match. A duel is a single game, and a match is a best 2 out of 3 duels. So after the first duel of a match, you gain access to your side deck. The cards in your side deck can be cards that belong in either your main or your extra deck that you are currently not playing in your main or extra deck at the start of the match. After the first duel, you're allowed to take out 1 card from your main or extra deck and replace it with 1 card in your side deck that can be put into that deck. You can take out more than 1 card at a time and put in more than 1 card at a time, but each card in your side deck can only take the place of 1 card in either your main or extra deck. The number of cards in your main, side, and extra deck should be the same as they were before side decking, when you begin games 2 or 3. Cards from your extra deck can only be substituted with cards that can go into the extra deck, and cards in the main deck can only be substituted with cards that can go into the main deck. You can substitute any number of cards from your side deck into your main deck or extra deck as long as you side out the exact same number of cards from both the main and extra deck. Every time you start a new match, your main deck must be constructed as if it was when you originally began playing in the tournament. So any cards that you sided in must be sided out, and any cards that were sided out must be sided back in for the start of game 1 of any new match. For this reason, it's always important to make your main deck built to be able to go first and second, because you don't know if you'll be going first or second during game 1, as this is decided by both a random method and a player's choice. Additionally, there is no reason to ever play less than 15 cards in your side deck. The side deck is almost more important than your main deck because you'll play more games with your side deck than without one. Because a match is played as best 2 out of 3 duels, the only time you will ever not be playing with your side deck is in game 1, which means if you ever get to game 3, you'll have automatically played more games with your side deck involved than without having access to your side deck. You may also want to have a couple of additional items to help you make sure that a game maintains a proper game state. You might need a coin or some dice available, as some card effects require you to flip a coin or roll dice. Most players favor using a die. When using a die for a coin effect, you can simply determine if the die landed on an odd number or an even number. Duelists also usually use dice to determine who will go first in game 1 of a match. Usually, both players will roll 2 dice and see who can get a higher roll to determine who will choose who will go first on the first turn of the duel. The winner of the dice roll gets to choose if they want to go first or second. Winning the dice roll does not state that you have to go first or second. It gives you the choice. After winning a dice roll, you must state if you intend to go first or second before drawing your starting hand and looking at it. If you look at it before declaring who will go first, you will have to go first. The loser of a duel chooses who goes first in the next duel of that match. Additional things you might want to keep around are called counters. Counters are applied to cards by card effects and are used to keep track of how many times something has occurred. The most common type of counter is called the spell counter, and is usually applied to a card every time a spell is activated and resolves. So a card may get anywhere from 0 to infinity spell counters. Counters are usually an object that is placed on top of an item in order to keep track of how many counters an item has. During official tournament play, you are not supposed to use a die and just place it onto the number of the counters that a card should have. You are supposed to actually have a certain number of objects placed on top of the card. But most players will still use a die as it's just far easier. A concern with the die is that it could roll onto an incorrect number. But you could just as easily lose one of the objects being used for the counters. While discussing counters, I figure I'll discuss a rule related to spell counters. If a card can put spell counters onto itself and it would be negated, it will no longer be able to hold spell counters, as being able to hold counters is part of its effect. Most cards that allow them to do something they normally wouldn't be able to do stop applying when they are negated. Some cards put counters on other cards like Predaplants and Cubics, and they will not go away when the card is negated, as there is no effect allowing those counters to be held. They can just be held. Another thing that would be good to have is called a token. A token is a card that is created by another card's effect. It is not a real card. You can buy or obtain official tokens in sealed products or as singles. Tokens cannot be face down and are treated as normal monsters. Tokens cannot be used for Xyz summons because they cannot exist as Xyz materials. You can use any object to represent a token as long as it can be clearly distinguished whether it's an attack or defense position. All properties of any face-up monster apply to tokens with the exception that they can never be face down. If a token would leave the field for any reason, it is simply removed from the game instead. Because tokens are simply removed from play when they would leave the field for any reason, they cannot be used as a cost for cards that would send a token to a place it cannot go. So if a card requires you to send a card to the graveyard as a cost, or return it to the hand as a cost, you cannot do so with a token. If a token were to leave the field by a card effect such as being destroyed or returned to the hand, it will simply be removed from the game instead, with the exception of being banished face down. Any card effect that would attempt to banish a token face down cannot be used on a token. So a card such as Cyframe Overload, which targets a card and banishes it face down, cannot be used against a token. It cannot target the token, as a token cannot be banished face down. Even a card like Evenly Matched, which requires your opponent to banish cards face down, cannot be used on the token. They will be unable to choose the token to banish. So they will choose as many other cards as possible to banish face down to resolve Evenly Matched. It's also a good idea to have a calculator around to quickly determine what damage is inflicted during a game. Given the opportunity to write down life points versus keep track of them on a calculator, it is preferable that you do so with pen and paper. It's also important that both players actually keep track of life points. Disputes over life points can be frustrating for both players. I'd recommend both players take life points at all times and then confirm with their opponent if they have the same life points before continuing on with the duel. Another thing you're going to need are called sleeves, which are simply plastic covers for your cards so that they do not get damaged while they are placed onto the field or while you are shuffling your deck. They prevent your cards from being marked, and having marked cards is not allowed in the game. A marked card is simply a card that you can identify while it is face down, or that you would be able to locate in a deck while shuffling. The last thing, which is technically optional, is called a game mat. There are two-player game mats and one-player game mats. If two players bring their one-player game mats together, you create what is called the field.
Many players have what is called the game mat. There are two-player game mats and one-player game mats. If two players bring their one-player game mats together, you create what is called the field. Many duelists use two-player game mats folded in half to be a one-player game mat. There are several different zones on the field. You don't actually need a physical mat to play, as long as both players know where the center of the field is. You can actually interpret where all other cards go, relative to the center of the field. Let's go over the actual zones on the field and come back to the field center later, as it is between two actual game zones. At the start of our duel, our deck is placed into the deck zone, which is on the lower right portion of our side of the field. It is shuffled and placed there face down, and at the start of the duel, both players will draw 5 cards from their deck. Drawing cards means to take a card from the top of your deck and add it to your hand. Our hand will consist of the cards we are going to be playing against our opponent. The contents of our hand are private knowledge, and we're not supposed to share that with our opponent. Certain pieces of information are considered public knowledge, and they can ask about them, and we are supposed to answer those questions as long as we don't reveal private information while doing so. And certain pieces of information are considered private knowledge, and it is against the rules to share this information. Things that are considered public knowledge are the number of cards in our hand, the number of cards in our deck, the number of cards in our graveyard, the number of cards in our extra deck. If someone asks for these numbers, we can always count the cards in these zones. Also, public knowledge is any other card that is face up on the field or in the graveyards or in the face up banished zones. Pretty much all cards that are face up are generally public knowledge, as well as the card text of any card in the game. If you want to know what any card says, you can look it up on your phone. You cannot demand your opponent answer what a card you believe is in their private location says, as it could force them to reveal private information. In a tournament, a judge can give you the information on any named card. In casual play with a friend, you would look it up on your phone. If a card is searched by a card effect to be added to a private location such as your hand, you are allowed to look at it to verify it fits the criteria of what card was being searched. That way you'll know the card's name before the card is placed in a private location. Once the card is placed in the hand or set, the information is no longer public. If you remember the searched card's name, you can still look up what it says or ask a judge to share the card's text. Things that are considered private knowledge are the contents of our hand, extra deck, face down banished cards, our entire main deck, or any of our cards that our opponent cannot see because they are face down. At no point are we supposed to share any of this information with our opponent. Even though some things are considered private knowledge from our opponent, we are allowed to look at certain things ourselves, such as our own hand, our face down extra deck, our face down banished cards, and our own face down cards on the field. The only face down section of cards that we control that we are not allowed to look at is our shuffled face down main deck, because it's meant to be in a random unknown order. We are also not supposed to be looking at our side deck during active games. The reason you're allowed to look at most of these locations is it allows you to determine if you're allowed to activate cards, because you need to know how many cards are available in your deck in order to activate certain cards. By looking at the contents of your hand, your graveyard, and your banished zone, you'll be able to determine if a card is still in your deck, assuming you haven't sided the card out after side decking during tournament play. Should you activate a card that you cannot legally resolve, you will get a warning and potentially an upgraded penalty that could cost you games or matches in a tournament. So it's important to know what cards are in your deck at all times. At the start of every turn during the draw phase, the turn player will draw 1 card from the top of their deck to their hand, with the exception of the first turn of the duel, in which case the turn player does not draw a card. This has been the case ever since the 3rd master rule of the game. We're currently on the 5th. The master rule is updated when new types of cards are added to the game, and some rules are completely changed to work with new types of cards and mechanics. The most recent one were link monsters. The extra deck is placed face down, on the bottom left side of our field, opposite of the main deck. In between the main deck and extra deck are our 5 spell and trap card zones. Spell and trap cards in our hand are placed into these zones either face up, which is to activate a spell or trap card, or face down, which is to set a spell or trap card. If you have no open spell or trap card zones, you cannot activate or set any more spell or trap cards. So it is important to try and leave some space available in your spell and trap card zones if you need to activate a card later in the duel. The left and rightmost spell and trap card zones are also called the pendulum zones, but they are only considered the pendulum zones when they are occupied by pendulum monsters as spell cards. We'll talk about pendulum monsters and pendulum spell cards much later on. Just note that these zones are considered regular spell and trap card zones unless they are occupied by a face-up pendulum monster as a spell card. Unless the card effect makes you do so, a pendulum monster should never be in any of the other spell and trap card zones. Above the 5 spell and trap cards zones are our 5 main monster zones. This is where you can put monsters when they're played. You can have up to 5 cards in these zones. There are 3 different positions a monster can be played in. There's face-up attack position, face-up defense position, and face-down defense position, which usually happens when a monster is normal set, which is to place a monster in face-down defense position using our turn's normal summon. We'll talk more about normal summon and set in a future video. When a card is upright, it's in attack position, and cards that are sideways are in defense position. Special summon monsters are generally summoned face up unless the card says otherwise. If you have no open monster card zones, you generally cannot summon any other monsters, with the one exception, which is if you were using the monster as a cost to summon another monster, such as summoning a monster from your extra deck by using your monsters in your main monster zones as a material for those monsters. So filling up your monster zones is not nearly as dangerous as filling up your spell and trap card zones. The zone above our deck is called the graveyard. This is where cards go when they are destroyed or sent as material for the summon of extra deck monsters. Spells and trap cards that resolve generally go to the graveyard after their effects are done resolving. There are spells and traps that would stay on the field after they resolved, such as continuous spell cards, equipment spell cards, as well as continuous trap cards. Pendulum monsters that would normally go to the graveyard from the field are placed face up on the extra deck instead. If they are in either the main monster zones or the pendulum zones, they would be placed face up on top of the extra deck. If they are sent from any other place, they would go to the graveyard like any other card. The zone opposite of the graveyard on the top left of our field is called the field spell zone. This is a special spell card zone which can only contain field spell cards. Field spells can be placed face up or face down in this zone. Both players can only control one field spell at a time. To use another field spell, you can send your previous field spell to the graveyard and then activate a new one, or set a new one. The first one is sent to the graveyard and is not considered destroyed. This is different from any other spell and trap card zone. If your other spell and trap zones are occupied by other spells and trap cards, you cannot just simply send them away in order to activate a new one. In the middle of the field, there are 2 zones called the extra monster zones. These are above the 2nd and 4th main monster zones and are used to summon monsters from the extra deck. Link monster summoned from the extra deck must be summoned to an extra monster zone or a main monster zone that another link monster points to. The same is also true for pendulum monsters that would be summoned face up from the extra deck. They must be summoned to the extra monster zone or a main monster zone that a link monster points to. Link arrows will not allow you to summon monsters into spell and trap card zones or to your opponent's field just because they point there. All other monsters that are summoned from the extra deck, such as fusions, synchros, and exceeds, can be summoned to any main monster zone or the extra monster zone. Monster summoned from any location besides the extra deck cannot be placed into the extra monster zone. Any monster that makes its way onto your field by any card effect cannot be placed into the extra monster zone unless it's being summoned from the extra deck. Each player can only control one extra monster zone. If you currently control an extra monster zone, your opponent can summon monsters to the other extra monster zone. If you have a monster in the extra monster zone and the other one is empty and you would like to use it to summon another monster from the extra deck, you can. By using the monster you currently control in the extra monster zone, you already control as material, and the new monster could be summoned into either extra monster zone. If the zone is occupied by your opponent's monster, you cannot switch into that extra monster zone. There is a way to control both extra monster zones called the extra link. We will cover the extra link in a future video on link monsters and link summoning. The space between the 2 extra monsters zones is known as the field center. While it is not technically part of the field, most players actually place an object into this part of the field because it's useful for identifying which zones are being used on the field. If you are playing with game mats that do not have any zones on them, the field center will let you determine which monster is in which zone, whether it's in the center main monster zone or one of the end main monster zones. While a field center is not technically required, it is very useful for keeping proper track of what cards are in which zones. While not technically on the field, the final zone is known as the banished zone and is generally placed above the graveyards, next to the extra monster zones. Some cards are placed in this zone by card effects or summoned from this zone by card effects. So the zone is used, but it technically does not exist. It is relevant for certain parts of the game. I like to think of this zone as the super graveyard. It's similar to the graveyard, but cards are a little bit harder to interact with in this zone. In the next part of this series, we'll learn how to read a Yu-Gi-Oh card and discuss the relevance of the different parts of each Yu-Gi-Oh card. We're now going to go over the parts of a Yu-Gi-Oh card. The different features of cards are relevant for supporting the different strategies you might choose to play. This is the card's name. When a card name is mentioned in another card's text, it will appear in quotation marks. If cards have the same name, they are considered to be the same card, even if they have different artworks. And as mentioned in the previous video, cards whose name are always treated as a named card count towards the 3-copy maximum when building your deck. Some cards will have a card's name when in certain places like the graveyard or field, but because they aren't always treated as having that card's name, they do not count towards the 3-card maximum. So you can play 3 copies of Cyber Dragon and 3 copies of Cyber Dragon Core, because its name isn't always treated as Cyber Dragon, only while it's on the field or in the graveyard. Some cards in the game will interact with specifically named cards, such as Eternal Soul, which interacts with cards specifically named Dark Magician. Any older fusion monsters require specifically named monsters as fusion material. Occasionally, extra deck monsters require specifically named materials, although more current cards require all kinds of requirements that are less strict than a specific card's name. Monsters' different features can always be a requirement of being a material for all types of extra deck monsters or for different card effects, costs, or activation requirements. Things such as their attributes, type, level, and stats can also be referenced, and we'll get to them shortly. A card with a specific name such as Dark Magician have many cards that interact with it. We call these cards support cards, such as the previously mentioned Eternal Soul. When building your deck, you should do research and see if any of your specifically named cards you intend to play have additional support that are worth playing. Some cards will actually share a few words or characters of a word in their name. All monsters which contain the word Evil Swarm are part of the Evil Swarm archetype and gain access to support cards that specify Evil Swarm card, Evil Swarm monster, or Evil Swarm spell or trap. The reason I chose this archetype is because most of the support cards refer to L-Swarm cards because the cards work on both Evil Swarm cards as well as Steel Swarm cards. The archetype names need not contain the exact text on the card, but should contain the characters specified on the support card to be able to use them in your deck. Most decks in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Are from different archetypes providing different supports to different decks. When cards are not restricted to working with other cards, everyone plays the exact same best cards. The restrictions on cards is what actually creates diversity in Yu-Gi-Oh! When cards have little to no restrictions on their use, we call them generic. Generic cards being good leads to everyone playing the same cards. Most monsters have a level. Count the number of stars here to find out the monster's level. Levels are used to determine if a normal monster or effect monster can be normal summoned or normal set without tribute. Ritual monsters cannot be normal summoned or set and are the only other type of monster that appears in the main deck. Pendulum monsters are half spell card, but their levels are only relevant for them being normal or effect monsters. Most monsters can be normal summoned or set. Some effect monsters do say they can be special summoned in some other way. Some effect monsters say they can only be special summoned and cannot be normal summoned or set at all, but for now we'll discuss how levels relate to normal summoning and setting. Assuming a monster can be normal summoned, you can summon it as long as its level is 1, 2, 3, or 4 without a tribute. A level 5 or 6 monster requires you to tribute one monster you control to normal summon it. A tribute just means to send one monster you currently control on your field to the graveyard and is the cost for normal summoning monsters with higher levels. Level 7 and higher monsters that can be normal summoned require 2 tributes. There are a few cards in the game that have their own special rules for how you can normal summon them. Some require 3 tributes, some can be summoned by tributing continuous spells or traps. Most players try to special summon higher level monsters as the tribute is a mechanic of the normal summon, so they will try to only normal summon low level monsters. A monster's level is important for many reasons beyond the ability to be normal summoned. It's also relevant when performing synchro, exceeds, and pendulum summons, which we'll discuss in a later video. Some monsters actually don't have levels. Exceeds monsters' stars are called the rank of the monster and is on the left side of its card. Link monsters have a link rating which will correspond to the number of the monster's arrows and is stated on the bottom right of the card. Cards effects that discuss level like Gravity Bind do not affect Exceed or Link monsters. Cards that would refer to monsters' link rating would not affect monsters with levels or ranks, and cards that would refer to ranks would not affect monsters with levels or link ratings. A monster's level, rank, and link rating can appear on different support cards and are things that can be interacted with. The Phantom Knight rank up Magic Force interacts with ranks, 1-for-1 interacts with levels, and Link Bound interacts with link rating. So it's important to consider the cards in the game that interact with the different types of cards in your deck. All monsters have an attribute. There are 7 different attributes: light, dark, earth, fire, wind, water, and divine. Spells and traps have a symbol as well, but they just say spell or trap on them. Just like all other parts of a card, a monster's attribute gives it access to different support cards. For instance, Allure of Darkness is often played in decks whose monsters are primarily dark. All monsters also have a different type. There are over 20 types in the game, such as Warrior and Dragon. New types come out on occasion. The Divine attribute came out after the other 6, but otherwise attributes have always been the same. A monster's type can also be relevant when looking at support cards or when making specific extra deck monsters. For example, the Synchro monster Baxia. Brightness of the Yongxing actually requires worm-type monsters to be used for its Synchro summon. The last feature unique to monsters are their attack points and defense points. High attack and defense points are good when battling. Link monsters actually cannot be in defense or face down. Some cards interact with monsters' attack and defense points such as Deck Devastation Virus. It requires a dark monster with 1500 or more attack to be tributed as a cost to activate it. We'll discuss costs more in the future, but for now I'll say that when cards have costs it is written prior to a semicolon in its effect box. All cards have a description box or effect box which tells you about the card's effects. Normal monsters have what is called flavor text, which is usually something fun about the card or story between cards in the game. Card effects are written in specific ways to be able to interpret them all the same way. Card effects are written using problem-solving card text or PSCT, and it allows us to read all cards same way to interpret how they're meant to work. We'll learn more about PSCT when we learn about the different types of effects in the game. The statement I made about cost being before a semicolon is an example of problem-solving card text used when writing newer Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Older Yu-Gi-Oh cards without reprints may not have PSCT, but they usually get reprinted if they ever see play, eventually with an errata, which just means an update to their card text to better represent what the card is supposed to do and will at that time get PSCT. Most spells are called normal spells, but there are several subtypes which each have different icons to identify what type of spell they are. The subtypes of spells are Equip, Field, Ritual, Quick Play, and Continuous. They each have their own rules in play and we'll address them in another video. Traps have two subcategories besides normal traps. There are also continuous traps just like there are spells. And there are also counter traps. In the next video we'll talk about the different monster types as well as how to summon them.
Monster cards are used to battle and defeat your opponent. Battles between monster cards are the foundation of any duel. There are many kinds of monster cards. This game is more than a simple slugfest, so monsters with high attack and defense points will not be enough. There are also monsters with strong special effects, even though their attack and defense points are low. Therefore, your success in a duel depends on how skillfully you can make use of the different kinds of cards. Let's take a look at the different kinds of monsters. First, there's the normal monster. Normal monsters are basic monster cards without any special abilities, and they have a yellow card border. There are other monsters without effects, but unless they are normal monster cards, tokens, or cards that say they are treated as normal monsters, then they are technically non-effect monsters, such as Scrap Archfiend, which is a synchro monster with no effect. It is a non-effect synchro monster, not a normal monster. Tokens are treated as normal monsters because it's in the rulebook on page 49. Many normal monsters used to have higher attack and defense points than effect monsters did, instead of having their special abilities. They've become less useful over time as effect monsters started having larger attack and defense values. Most duelists which play normal monsters tend to play them for reasons other than their stats. Sometimes they're used as targets for certain support cards that help their overall strategy. The rock deck Adamantipator used to play the normal monster, Beta the Magnet Warrior, as the target for the spell card Unexpected Die, which allows them to access a level 4 rock monster very easily. There weren't many other support cards that can achieve this objective. The Harpy deck also plays the Unexpected Die to summon a normal monster from the deck, so it plays the normal monster Harpy Lady. The Harpy deck also has a support card called Harpy Perfumer, which when it is summoned can search for Elegant Egotist, which is a normal spell card that can be used to summon Harpy Lady from the deck. So the normal monster was played as a combo piece, rather than for just being a normal monster. Other normal monsters that see modern play are the Mystic Shineball in Agent decks, as they can be summoned by the effect of the Agent of Creation Venus multiple times per turn and create material for powerful extra deck plays. Some decks play Psyframe Gear Gamma as a form of disruption, but Gamma requires you to play the normal monster, Psyframe Driver, to use their powerful effects. Many players get upset when they draw a Driver, as it has limited use in your hand because it is a high-level monster and would require a tribute to summon it, and you'll usually have effect monsters that you would prefer to summon instead. Also, it can be summoned for free from your deck by the Psyframe Gear Gamma, so it's preferable to never draw this card. Currently, a very powerful deck is the Sun Avalon Plant deck, which can perform its entire combo line if you open the normal monster Sunseed Genius Loci. Explaining the combo is not the purpose of this video. I'm just trying to show you that different normal monsters are occasionally played. An effect monster is a monster with special abilities and has an orange card border. The effects of monsters are split into 4 different categories: continuous effects, ignition effects, quick effects, and trigger effects, and we'll be discussing a particular subcategory of trigger effects separately called a flip effect. Continuous effects are active while an effect monster is face up on the field. The effect starts once the monster appears on the field and ends once the monster is no longer face up on the field, or if it is negated. There is no trigger for its activation, so it will not start a chain at all. We'll talk about chains in a future video. Most continuous effects can be identified by a monster's effect being written as a single sentence without any punctuation to indicate that the card activates or has a cost, such as a colon or a semicolon. These monsters are most useful if you play a strategy to protect them while they are on the field. One of the most commonly played monsters with a continuous effect at the moment is Vanity's Ruler, which prevents your opponent from special summoning while it is on the field. Many continuous effects prevent your opponent from doing something, and we refer to cards that prevent your opponent from doing something as floodgates. Vanity's Ruler also happens to have a condition, which is not a continuous effect. Its condition is that it cannot be special summoned. This is not an effect, it is just a restriction, and it cannot be negated. Some cards have restrictions in their text that cannot generally be avoided. Another card with a restriction is the Phantom Knights of Rusty Bardiche, which says it cannot be used as link material, which would actually make the card much better, as being able to link climb is a good thing. We'll actually be talking about link summoning in the next video. The next type of effect is the Ignition effect. Ignition effects are a type of effect you can activate by just declaring that you're going to activate it during your main phase, while the card is in a place where it can be activated. Usually this will be on your field. The monster Sword Soul of Taiye has an effect that can be activated while it is face up on your field during your main phase. There are other monsters that actually have ignition effects that can be activated in other places. Also in the Sword Soul deck is Sword Soul Strategist Long Wan, which can be activated while it is in your hand. The Sword Soul deck often also plays Tenyi monsters. The Tenyi monster, Tenyi Spirit Ashina, has a ignition effect that you can use during your main phase while the card is either in your hand or in your graveyard. The biggest benefit of an ignition effect is that you can choose when to activate this effect, as trigger effects are often forced to be activated at a particular moment, and you may not want to use them at those moments. You can identify an ignition effect because it will not state anywhere on the card that it can be used when something happens. It might have a condition to activate, such as the card must be in a certain place, but it will not say if something happens or when something happens. The best type of monster effect is the quick effect. If a monster has a quick effect, it can activate in response to other monsters or other cards. Quick effects can be activated during either player's turn, and are often not restricted to being only activated during the main phase. Although with so many cards in the game, there are often cards that do have restrictions on their quick effects, whether they be to be used during one player's turn, both players' turns, on certain phases, or only in response to other cards. The reason you can use quick effects in response to other cards is that they have a speed spell of 2, and all other monster effects that activate have a speed spell of 1. Continuous effects do not activate and have no speed spell. We'll discuss speed spell in another video, but do know that generally being a quick effect makes a card better than being an ignition effect or a trigger effect. That's because of the freedom that's awarded to these cards by being quick effects. An example of a monster with a quick effect would be the incredible Ecclesia the Virtuous, which if it's just on your field, at any point you can tribute it to summon a Sword Soul monster directly from your deck. The most commonly played card in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, which has a quick effect. This quick effect has the requirement that it must be activated in response to a card that would be activated. Most cards that negate other cards have quick effects that can respond to other cards. Most cards that have quick effects say the quick effect on them in parentheses, although older cards might say during either player's turn, such as the card Cosmo Dark Planet. Should Dark Planet ever get a reprint, it will most likely be updated to say quick effect in parentheses, as an errata. Trigger effects are effects that can be activated when certain conditions are met. These effects are activated at specific times, such as when this card is used as link material, such as Marinta Spring Girl, which can be activated when it's used to perform a link summon of a water monster, or when a card says when this card is destroyed, such as the Unchained Twins Aruha, or many cards have the trigger effect when this card is normal summoned or special summoned, such as Tour Guide from the Underworld, which you can activate when it is normal summoned. These cards can be great for some combos because when you activate multiple trigger effects at the same time, you can build a chain and make certain plays safer than others by following the rules of simultaneous effects go on chain, also known as SEGOC, which we'll talk about in another video. There are times when trigger effects can be better than ignition effects, and sometimes where ignition effects will be better than trigger effects. One of the benefits of trigger effects is creating a chain and protecting certain cards. Additionally, trigger effects are not restricted to only being activated during the main phase, as if a card's trigger condition is to activate when it is destroyed, it can be destroyed during any phase. A card with a trigger effect would be Sword Soul of Moyi, whose condition is to activate when it is normal or special summoned. Trigger effects don't activate in response to other cards, and will usually activate in the next available chain after their trigger condition is met. If multiple cards meet their trigger condition simultaneously, you will then create a chain of those cards. With a recent update to the rules of the game, summons as you want per turn. In general, a monster's battle position cannot be changed the turn it is summoned or set, or if it had already attacked to a monster's type, such as Dragon, it might say Effect, and if it is a flip effect, it will say Flip. A flip effect monster that does currently see play is Shadal Dragon. There are other subtypes of monsters that we'll be addressing in the future, such as Gemini, Spirit, Union, and Tuner, but these are more conditions of a card rather than a different type of effect, such as a flip. While talking about trigger effects, it's important to mention that there are if effects and when effects. Cards with if effects cannot miss timing, which means that if a trigger meets its condition and says the word if